We are living in a time where educational institutions are facing unprecedented challenges, from rapid technological change and evolving learner expectations to global uncertainty and increasing demands on leaders. In such times, effective educational leadership becomes more important than ever. Today's session will explore how leaders can navigate complexity, build resilience, and create meaningful impact within their institutions and communities. A very good afternoon to everyone. My name is Josen Ranyola, and welcome to today's masterclass, Educational Leadership in Turbulent Times by Dr. Bee Hughes. And to help us to guide this conversation, I am joined by my colleague, Pia Salvan. Pia, it's great to have you as with us today.
Thank you so much, Josen, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us from all across the UAE and around the world. At the University of Manchester, we believe that leadership is not only about managing change, it's about inspiring people through change. And nowhere is that more relevant than in education today, of course. Whether you're an educator, a school leader, a policymaker, or someone passionate about the future of learning, we hope today's discussion provides valuable insights and practical perspectives that you can take back to your own professional journey. We also, of course, encourage everyone to participate by submitting your questions through the Q&A function throughout the session. We will also be dedicating time at the end of a live session discussion for our speaker. But before we get started, let's take a moment to discover the University of Manchester, not only as a university, but as a vibrant city, a leading academic institution, and a global community driving innovation, ideas, and meaningful impact worldwide. The University of Manchester is the UK's largest single site university, and it's part of the prestigious Russell Group, known for its strong focus on research, teaching, and social responsibility. It has a rich history of innovation, from splitting the atom to creating the first stored program computer to discovering graphene. The university is home to 26 Nobel Prize winners, and it's currently ranked on the top 35th globally and 21st for executive MBA by QS World Rankings. And of course, it's top 50 across the world by Financial Times. Its MBA is triple accredited by AMBA, AACSB, and EQUIS, placing it among less than 1% of business schools worldwide to achieve this level of excellence. Of course, we are very proud to say that the University of Manchester is a global leader in higher education, known not only for academic excellence, but for real world impact. Since 2019, it has consistently ranked in the global top 10, and it's currently first in the UK and Europe and second in the world, highlighting its strong commitment to social and environmental change. And here in the Middle East, the University of Manchester, Dubai, established in 2006, is the largest and fastest growing international hub in the AMBS network. It brings together a diverse community of over 100 nationalities with 2,000 plus MBA graduates, 3,600 students, and over 5,000 alumni across the region. Part of a global network with centers in Manchester, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, and Singapore, the Dubai branch offers programs such as the MSc in Financial Management. We have the Global Part-Time MBA program, the Global Executive MBA, Executive Education, and the Masters in Educational Leadership in Practice. And good news for everyone, the university has also been officially licensed by the UAE Ministry of Higher Education, and all of its programs have its full accreditation, marking a significant milestone for Manchester in Dubai. And now, if you are not yet keen for a 2-year program, our executive education programs are designed for managers and leaders, delivered in an intensive face-to-face format over 4 to 5 days. Each course can be taken individually or it can also be combined to achieve a Manchester Professional Diploma in Leadership. Participants will also receive digital recognition for each course completed, making it a flexible and impactful way to develop professionally. And of course, that is up to 5,500 sterling pounds every course you take. And over here, we will give you time to scan the QR code for more information on our next set of courses. You can also apply now and avail our 15% off.
Thank you, Pia. And now it's truly an absolute pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker for today. She's a senior lecturer in education at the University of Manchester and a deputy director of the Education Leadership and Practice program with extensive experience as a senior school leader in both the UK and Hong Kong. Her research focuses on education leadership, educational policy, school structures, and critical policy studies. She is the co-convener of the Critical Education Leadership and Policy Research Group and served as a deputy editor of the journal Management in Education. Her award-winning research explores leadership practices within school systems, particularly multi-academy trusts, and she is widely recognized for her contributions to educational leadership scholarship and policy analysis. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome the Deputy Director of Education Leadership in Practice at the University of Manchester, Dr. Bee Hughes. Doctor, very good afternoon to you.
And a very good afternoon to you and all your colleagues at the Dubai Centre, and of course, all the colleagues joining us online. I think there's over 70 of you, so a warm welcome from me in wet Manchester. English people always talk about the weather. So it's a great privilege to be here, and thank you so much for the kind invitation and the very generous introduction.
Absolute pleasure, Dr. B. You may now
Perfect.
proceed.
Thank you. So when we were discussing what potentially we could think about a theme, I recognise that the context in which we operate as educationalists, as leaders, as teachers, as principals and so on within an education or institution, other institutions, we are facing, as Joe mentioned in his introduction, the notion of turbulent and complex times. And of course, this era we're in is marked by, of course, we recognise rapid change, uncertainty, and of course, this notion of increasing complexity within the world. And particularly my heart and thoughts go out to the Middle East at this uncertain time. But of course, there are lots of emphases that people turn to education leaders, and they are therefore challenged to lead with clarity and courage and, of course, purpose. That hasn't changed, but perhaps the context in which we are now operating as education leaders starts to ask and pose certain questions about how we respond in terms of our values in leading our institutions. So this session, I'm hoping, will invite you as professional educators or thinkers to critically re-examine our sense of values, in fact, what are values themselves that underpin our education leadership. And I'm hoping to move beyond technical solutions and think more initially in a theoretical place, and then moving from a theoretical lens about what we understand about values and morals within education, think about how those ideas, those theories, may apply and help us understand our own context, particularly in the UAE. So hopefully we'll have a bit of theory. I'm an academic, so you're always going to get a bit of theory. And I'm going to introduce you to two big thinkers in relation to leadership, but particularly, at least one of them has written extensively from North America and Canada on moral leadership and values. So hopefully that will give you some insights into our work this hour or so. Please do ask questions and put anything you want to know in the chat. There's no guarantee I know the right answers, but I'm very happy to engage with some form of debate about questioning our assumptions and also thinking about how we can manage these very turbulent times. So a warm welcome to you. They're three of the wonderful colleagues that I have the pleasure and privilege of working with when I visit Dubai, usually once or twice a year when I come over and teach on our course, MA Education, Leadership and Practice. So they're the three smiling, wonderful people, amongst others, who work at the Dubai Centre. Thank you. Next slide, please. So let's look at these aims. We're going to look at exploring values, as I said, initially from a slightly theoretical perspective, and then how we can apply these ideas to our own work. And then I'm going to perhaps offer some hopeful future horizon scanning for us all to go away with a sense of purpose and hope, and hopefully some joy as well. So that's kind of the framing of this session. Thank you. There will obviously be opportunities for you to ask questions. Thank you. Next slide, please. I want to start, and I'm using a couple of images, and this is an image I just want to describe to you, and then I'm going to interpret the image from my particular perspective as a critical scholar. The image, of course, taken in April 2025, is iconic. It's historical, and I would say it's momentous. It is, of course, political. It speaks to power, hidden power and influence. And the question I asked myself when I came across this image was this a moment for the entire world to indicate a recalibration of the relationship between the US President, Donald Trump, and the Ukraine President, Zelensky, after the debacle of the Oval Office a few weeks before? If you remember, you may be aware that Zelensky visited Trump in the Oval Office with many, many other people, and Trump and his colleagues were very difficult and troubling, may I say unprofessional. I may also suggest a bullying notion took place in terms of rather cold welcome of Zelensky, and it was very controversial, that moment in the Oval Office. And this is some months later, and I was interested in thinking about this in terms of world leaders on a world stage. And what we see in this photograph is the leaning in, revealing perhaps a level of intimacy and privacy to some degree in the most public of spaces. The appearance of two very different leaders talking in hushed tones, we assume, in the marbled halls of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a symbol of a powerful global religion where not many meters away beyond this photograph lay the body of a dead pope, because of course this was the day of the Pope's funeral. The photograph is extraordinary. Sorry, can you go back? The photograph is extraordinary on so many levels. The question we might ask ourselves is leadership so profoundly political? And does the politics of leadership override all other discourses of grief and undermine a profoundly religious ceremonial rite? We observe the blending of soft power of the church, of course, as we see the symbols symbolized by the ordinariness on the left-hand side of the priest attending to some function. We see two men, powerful men at that, sitting, hands clasped, we assume talking. So the question we ask here is, does leadership and its exercise of power override values, override everything else? And therefore, is there hope, any hope perhaps, for school leaders when world leaders are modelling something very different over two moments in time, the Oval Office and this particular moment in time captured by this particular photograph? Thank you. Next slide, please. So the question we might want to consider is, in a world where the norms and values of leadership are being publicly disrupted in the political realm, what can our study of education leadership do to counter these destructive tendencies? And that's the question I'll come back to, and hopefully you can engage with as we progress through this particular webinar. Thanks. Next slide, please. And so we come to, let's now look at, through a theoretical lens, unpacking the idea of values leadership. And I'm going to just make reference to, in this first couple of slides, Thomas Sergiovanni, who's an American scholar who's based, I think, now in Texas, but has written, certainly in the 1990s, wonderful books called Leadership and Heartbeat and the Heartbeat of Schools. And he is quite, certainly in the 1990s, his work's shifted a bit, but he is certainly involved with looking at moral leadership and values-driven practice. And so he argues, as I do, that managerial and technocratic models of school leadership are not necessarily the answer. They're part of our work, but they're not necessarily the answer to leadership in turbulent times. He argues that leadership, in a way, cannot be reduced to techniques and competencies or formal authority. And instead, he argues that leadership is fundamentally a moral and ethical practice, rooted in shared values, purposes, and key commitments. And I think probably as educators and leaders, we would probably agree with that kind of understanding of leadership. And what I would add as we go through this webinar, this masterclass, is we acknowledge that leadership is relational. So we don't necessarily, certainly in my critical scholarship perspective at Manchester, we don't necessarily argue specifically that leadership is a thing, that it's rarefied. We argue that leadership can be perceived as an experience or the exercise of power and or influence. And this is where we get into values-driven practice. Thank you. Next slide, please. Now, unpacking Sir Giovanni's understanding of moral authority over bureaucratic authority. So many of our institutions are highly bureaucratic, my university being one of them. And bureaucratic authority derives from formal positions and rules, as we know, and hierarchical power. There's clearly a place for that. I'm not arguing that we diminish hierarchies, but we need to understand our relationship to those hierarchies and develop notions, as Sir Giovanni encourages us, a moral authority. Now, Sir Giovanni argues that this moral authority emerges when people, ostensibly those with influence or power at any level of the organisation, I would argue, articulate and embody sustained shared values that are recognised as legitimate by the school community. In other words, they're accepted by the school community and they're understood by the school community. So in this particular framing by Sir Giovanni, he would argue that leadership influence flows not from position, the principal, the vice chancellor, the CEO, but from a position of credibility, trust, and value alignment. Now, for me, this idea is particularly significant in educational settings, where professional judgment, ethical responsibility, and care for learners cannot be effectively governed through managerial control alone. And one of the examples I will share with you at this moment is, our university is a huge bureaucratic institution. And what I see and experience as an employee, as an academic, is the wonderful sense I get of professional autonomy. When I was a head teacher in a school, as many of you may be, I was kind of dictated by my PA, by meeting schedules, and by bells. And my day was broken up by those kind of structures that were hierarchical structures, of course. And the culture of the university is very different. However, because of its highly managerial structure in the university, because it's so big, we have 10,000 employees, 47,000 students, both postgraduate and undergraduate, managerial control starts to diminish, and that can cause some problems. The sense of Sir Giovanni that offers us an insight, and he worked with schools, so I'm going to keep it with schools today. He reconceptualized schools as, he called them moral communities, and we might want to unpack moral communities a little bit later, but he didn't see them necessarily as specifically organizations, and I kind of share that view, certainly from my perspective as an educator within high schools over 30 years, but certainly this moral community, Sir Giovanni argues, members are bound together by shared purposes and norms and values rather than external accountability pressures alone. And I will come on to the external accountability pressures that we're all under a little later when we look at the UAE more precisely in a practical sense. So for Sir Giovanni, leadership therefore involves nurturing a sense of belonging, collective responsibility, and moral purpose. Next slide, please. And what he talks about is leadership is moral and ethical, and we've talked about him not being just a technical role. He talks a lot about stewardship, and he talks a lot about this notion of taking care and stewarding not only the institution and its reputation and its brand and all the rest of it, but stewardship of our colleagues and of course of our students. And certainly in the England, head teachers and so on and leaders, whatever level of the organisation, are kind of expected more and more to be stewards of their relatively local community. And that certainly is very much part of work that some, not all, but some senior head teachers and CEOs within the English system certainly start to think about being stewarding. And I think for schools that are proprietor led, that are owned by particular franchisees or franchises, that there is a distinction and tension sometimes between the stewarding of the institution and the brand and the stewardship of our students and our curriculum and our intentions and our cultures when we're in the institution itself. So we may come on to that notion of moral communities and how these are bound together by shared purposes, but also we need to understand whose values are they, and we'll come into that. Thank you. Next slide, please. So our key takeaways from Sir Giovanni is that we're not simply managers, and we must see ourselves as leaders and custodians, the stewardship bit, responsible for this shared moral enterprise. And it's important that we kind of think about that, because moral purpose is a significant and serious endeavour. And as you see on the slide, it's important that we think about our own place in our own space within our own context in terms of establishing the ethical fabric of the school itself. And so we are not just accountable for results. We think often that's the case, and inspection regimes that can be oppressive and demanding and challenging and frustrating and problematic on many levels. But it's also about the stewarding and the moral enterprise of leadership is for protecting and advancing the long-term values of education itself. Now, that's a huge statement. And I think people are looking towards, in these turbulent times, not answers necessarily, but guidance and inspiration where we might look elsewhere for that. And we'll talk a little bit about that guidance and inspiration that may come to us when we are starting to think more deeply about our responsibilities, not just for our schools and our students and our teachers and our parents, but also for education itself. Thank you. Another scholar who I know well, who's formerly a professor of education leadership at the University of Manchester, she's now retired. So Helen Gunter is Professor Emerita, and she's written extensively and is an eminent leader in the field of education leadership. But she comes from values from a particular position, which is what we would call more to do with looking at power, the place and location of power, and she critiques values as a concept or as a series of concepts. So she would argue, taking a critical stance, that values are not neutral. They operate in what we would say is a leadership discourse. And Helen Gunter argues that rather than assuming values are shared or they're benign, she asks, well, yes, values are important and importantly situated, but whose values are being promoted and in whose interests? Now, she looks at this in a detail and she talks about leadership theories, including those that are value-based, those that Sir Giovanni in the 1990s started to think about. And she thinks of values as some form of power and knowledge that can support notions of managerialism and performativity, the value of success, the value of results, or the discourse of results, or the valuing of grades and competition and league tables, which are all very big features in education systems here. So Gunter therefore reframes leadership in its wider sense as political. And she therefore would argue then that we must pay greater attention as leaders and academics to notions of inequality that some values may nominally and notionally perpetuate without necessarily intending. And of course, Helen Gunter talks about student voice as a sense of value, and we see that as a form of leadership, and notions around democratic values. So Gunter looks at values in a slightly different way and shifts attention in terms of educational leadership, the attention on education leadership as a field of knowledge and control. So she says, or she argues in her writings, extensive though they are, that values-based leadership and educational principles are useful and important, and they are promulgated in terms of ethics or notions of best practice, that they serve managerial value. And Gunter interrogates how these actually function in an ideological way. So she says that values themselves, when they're listed on websites or on branded materials, that they can be a source of managing people, of enabling, I wouldn't say forcing, but encouraging people to adhere to these values, or question mark. And that's important because what she says are the values that are articulated by whomever can mask power, and therefore can in some way narrow professional autonomies or even democratic possibilities. So she's kind of troubling this whole sense of values and what they are, what they symbolize, what they represent. Sir Giovanni's concept of moral authority rests on the ideas that leaders gain legitimacy through shared values and ethical credibility. And you can't really argue against that. And he would argue that whereas Gunter suggests power is manifested in the values themselves and how they're articulated, Sir Giovanni would argue that power is softened through elements and practices of and experiences of trust and this notion of stewardship. And he would argue that conflict is implicitly something that can be resolved through consensus and through value alignment. Inevitably, Helen Gunter would problematize that assumption of Sir Giovanni's. She would argue from a critical perspective that values can obscure structural inequalities, and we can unpick that. What I mean by that is, some policies or values that state very clearly that are admirable and so on and so forth may in fact promote inequalities that perhaps hadn't been examined. Values also can, if they're articulated in certain ways, marginalizing dissenting voices, student voice. When students complain about something, they do a lot at the university. They're consumers, they're paying money, they're adults. Student voice is taken very seriously at the University of Manchester, but sometimes these voices can be marginalized, not necessarily intentionally, but structurally can be marginalized. And so we say we value student voice, and we are very much as a university into promoting the student experience to be as positive and supportive, as challenging, inspiring through teaching and research. But yet, do we really understand and listen to the dissenting voices that are experiencing other things other than those that we think we are providing at the university? So it's ostensibly, Gunter would suggest that leadership is entangled, is problematized with power, policy and governance. In other words, we go back to that question, whose values are they? Are they mine as a principal of a school? Are they shared with my middle leaders, head of science or mathematics and so on? Or are they the governors who are overseeing, or the board of trustees? The university has a board of governance who actually espouses these particular values. Or is it, in our case, at Manchester University, University of Manchester, is it our new vice chancellor who's starting to talk about the vision for 2035 for the University of Manchester and how those values are associated with the university. Thanks. Next slide, please. So our key takeaway is that Gunter's work, therefore, typically complicates Sir Giovanni's optimism. That's nothing wrong with that, and it's important we are critically engaging with these two big thinkers and linking them together, because Gunter kind of questions the optimism because she states basically that values based leadership cannot be understood outside the political dimension. And let's not go back, but let's draw our mind back to that photograph of Zelensky and Trump, that there's a political and structural condition operating there. It was a very public moment, wasn't it? And so there was lots of micro politics going on in that moment. And Gunter argues that values, however they're manifested, are always associated politically with political and structural conditions. And you'll imagine we are talking from a perspective of sociology here. We're not looking at leadership traits and behaviors. That's more psychological. Thanks. Next slide, please. Thank you. So hopefully those few slides and debating those notions of values, that the study, the theorizing of values is quite complicated. And we see two different perspectives. In my view, they can be complementary, but they will pose different questions about how we understand leadership values, particularly against a backdrop of turbulent times. And so Sir Giovanni is a normative scholar. He functionally talks about what leadership should or ought to be liked and why moral leadership is desirable. That's perfectly legitimate, of course. Gunter is explicitly critical as opposed to normative, and she talks about how leadership norms come to be established and who benefits from them and whose interests are these sets of values that we articulate widely, whose interests do they in fact serve. Thanks. Next slide, please. So we now can summarize briefly with these values and how they matter and why they matter, and why we should be cautious in Helen Gunter's arguments about how values are used. So we're not saying you should not have values or moral purpose in our work, particularly as leaders within education, but we just need to encourage our leadership or leaders to think about their ethical commitment and be critically aware of those values, revisit them, rethink about them, rearticulate them in ways that we can really understand, and what are the implications of our articulation of these values in a particular way that we can critique them in certain moments. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we see that the theoretical perspectives, we can now think about thinking in your contexts about applying these ideas, these theoretical ideas, to the UAE perspective. And I'll take two tracks on this, if I may. We'll talk about Sir Giovanni and how we might think about why values matter in practice, and then we'll talk about Helen Gunter's work and see how these align within the particularities and specifics of the context of the UAE and its complex education systems, against the backdrop of some challenging times and turbulent times that we're facing, particularly in the Gulf at the moment, as we are very made aware. I'm not sure our press are particularly helpful. I was talking to Joe just before we came on the webinar, and what's being reported in the Western press is somewhat different in terms of experiences in the Middle East. So we do understand and appreciate the complexities of that happening. Thank you. Next slide, please. So let's look at Sir Giovanni and why he says, and we've talked about that, leadership is moral practice and so on and so forth. But in UAE schools, as far as I understand them, and please, add your own comments to my assessment of UAE schools, that leaders often work with strong accountability frameworks. That's not unusual and that's not different. But we do understand and appreciate these include inspection regimes, accreditation requirements, and international benchmarks. That's the difference probably between English schools here and those that are in international contexts, particularly those in the UAE. So for Sir Giovanni, his work reminds us that leadership cannot be reduced to meeting those external demands alone. Excuse me. It's about managing them. And schools in the UAE, from perhaps a Sir Giovanni perspective, are quite understandably and perhaps more pronounced moral communities shaped by cultural, religious, and educational values. And that's interesting, isn't it? That notion of cultural, religious, and education values, and how we can navigate and articulate those elements of a value system, which are explicit and implicit to our own school and our own context. So we understand that from Sir Giovanni's perspective with the UAE, this involves safeguarding purposes such as student well-being, inclusion, and education integrity, of course, alongside performance outcomes. And so we start to think about leaders having ethical grounding and having them think about navigating, and they do, and if you're a leader, you'll know what I'm talking about, navigating these tensions between inspection and accountability and managerial elements of leadership that's imposed externally, and what we or you or leaders believe is right morally right for learners and staff. Thanks. Next slide, please. So we start to look at how we as leaders in the UAE, or how you as leaders in the UAE can think about this leading through moral authority rather than just positional power. And I hope I've kind of established that that's the kind of argument I'm making, that we're talking more widely as opposed to positional power. We're talking about this notion in terms of Sir Giovanni's terms, moral authority and stewardship. So as far as I know and understand and appreciate, schools and education in the UAE is certainly schools prioritize relationships and trust in highly diverse staff communities. I'm thinking perhaps more international schools than necessarily public schools, but I'm not excluding those. And I indicated that international schooling in any context is quite complicated in terms of curricula and so on and so forth. But certainly in the UAE, leaders may choose to support teacher professional judgment rather than imposing rigid lesson structures purely to satisfy inspection expectations. And if you're a school leader or a middle leader, you can, yeah, we try and do that, but we've got this imposition of the inspection and accountability structures. And so it's difficult to resist. And we may get onto that in a minute. But the moral authority might involve, in this sense, using Sir Giovanni's ideas, to protecting staff from excessive workload. We can do quite a lot as leaders, wherever we are, again, in the organisation, to try and understand morally the experiential moments of our teachers when they're preparing for inspection cycles. Or we can take a moral stance, and difficult though this may be at times, in resisting practices that start to generate and privilege data over well-being of young people and perhaps even well-being of our staff. And where we think authentic learning experiences, experimentation, project-based learning, debate, discussion, and so on, sometimes get overwritten because of the demands of accountability and inspection. And teaching to the test is a massive problem for primary schools here in the UK, and for example. So Sir Giovanni would stand up and resist to a certain degree the issues around those I've just described by legitimizing leadership decisions that actually foreground care, professionalism, and long-term education values rather than short-term inspection performance. Now, of course, that's all very easy for me to say as an academic. We do kind of articulate these ideas, and so many of you might say, well, hang on a minute, that's fine having all these ideas and these theories, but you have no idea what it's like in practice. And to a certain degree, I would agree with that argument. But what I'm hoping to do is throw out some ideas to stimulate thinking. Some of those ideas may not be appropriate or practicable, but they may just pose more questions than answers, and that's probably the purpose of this webinar. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what does Gunter help us with in terms of our work and in the UAE context? Well, we know that leadership models, and leaders themselves, by the way, are often imported through international school groups, confederations, franchises, and so on and so forth, through consultants or global best practice frameworks. I have a PhD student at the University of Manchester who's looking at leadership in private schools, so-called, or international schools in Brazil. He's an English colleague, but he was teaching in South America for many years, and he recognised that leaders were never appointed by international schools. Local leaders were never appointed into international schools. The notion of whiteness and Western education systems is privileged far more over local capable people. And so that's an interesting challenge that Gunter would argue that is not necessarily always appropriate. And so she encouraged leaders to ask those critical questions about values embedded in these particular models themselves, whether recruitment models or the values articulated by, international school groups that are very much appropriate for a kind of corporate, wider sphere, but not necessarily linking to the actual localized context of the school in a particular area. So this is what she's saying. We need to think about discourses of effectiveness and innovation or excellence, and how do they particularly align with local cultural values, or do they primarily serve a market for branding purposes? So there's that tension again between whose values are they, what's our moral purpose, and how we can, to a certain degree, articulate these values in a particular way that would satisfy our governing bodies or our senior colleagues in terms of international school groups and so on and so forth, but also recognise the importance of the cultural local dimension, particularly in the complexities within the UEA. The other thing that Gunter would probably help us with within our UAE context is that we can see shared values can be used to secure conformity. There's nothing wrong with being conforming. That often is a mode of resistance. To conform often is a mode of resistance in a particular way. But she would also argue, and I think she's right here, that genuine professional engagement, having those moments, and I may be in the staff room, it may be in a meeting, where we debate the fundamentals of education practice and leadership, where we debate the purpose of what we're doing, and where we can therefore, in what she would say, in the public domain, the polis, the political domain, where we are together in consensus, those debates about values and engagement and resistance are really important, whether we're in the UAE, or whether we're elsewhere. Thanks. Next slide, please. So she would argue, again, that we need to be critically reflexive about this notion of where we are in our own context, in this case, the UAE, and why we question certain leadership practices and why we prioritize certain practices in and during inspections. Let me give you a simple example. Many years ago, I was a deputy head of a very big school in North London, had all the challenges around social economic deprivation, as well as having students who were, from senior middle class and kind of quite socioeconomically privileged positions. So we had a very wide-ranging student body, and we had a big inspection coming up, which was then 5 days of several people being involved with the school, walking around the school and observing lessons and observing students and so on and so forth. And as you probably all know, inspections are not necessarily joyous occasions. They can be problematic. They can be deeply, deeply challenging for teachers, and behaviours change because we're almost teaching to the Ofsted requirement or whatever it may be. And as I was supporting staff as I felt I should, and be available and enable teachers when they'd been observed to come to the staff room and have a cup of tea and so on and so forth, the head teacher did something quite remarkable. She was a wonderful head teacher, and she bought boxes and boxes of candies, of sweets. And in England, we have these sweets are called celebrations, and the little candies. And she kept putting celebrations candies in everyone's pigeonhole every couple of hours. Let's celebrate, let's celebrate. And that sense of her valuing her staff, including myself, was profound. It was a very small gesture, but it made such a difference. People were talking about chewing their sweets over a cup of tea and, felt they were supported, felt that they were valued, and the small gestures of kindness develops trust and reciprocity, right? And this notion was so well received. This activity was so well received, and it was something very small but thoughtful. They're the things we're talking about, aren't we? When we're talking about turbulent times cannot dictate our own practice. They can to a certain degree, but we'll get onto that a little bit later. I'm giving too much away. Anyway, that's important, but we do need to think about these moments and meetings and engaging with, consensus, a sense of the common sense approach to values. And this is what Gunter urges us and urges leaders, particularly who have influence, to remain alert to power, to remain alert to what is actually telling us about inequality. And let's think about the political nature of leadership work, particularly within global educational systems. So there were two theoretical points from Sir Giovanni and from Gunter, distinct and different, but perhaps can relate a little bit. Then I've kind of tried to relate their thinking and their theorizing about leadership and values leadership and moral leadership into a more specific place relative to the UAE context. I hope that's been helpful. And the sense of this bit of the presentation is, well, yeah, that's really tough. There's issues of, you've talked about resistance, you've talked about tension, we've talked about turbulent times. And, I would want to know, well, okay, where is the hope and light? Can we have the next slide, please? And there is hope and there is light in everything we do, whether it's at this moment in time, whether it was during COVID, whether it was at the uncertain times that, particularly the UAE have experienced in the most recent past. There was hope for Zelensky in that moment with Trump after his humiliation in the Oval Office, through no fault of his own, by the way. There was a sense of hope I felt in that photograph I showed you earlier on. And so we see leadership practices can emerge stronger in moments of crisis, in moments when our very sense of who we are as humans, not necessarily leaders or teachers, we can develop stronger dispositions that help us get through this, whatever this is. I recognise, certainly in my experience in schools, when we had challenges, a child dying in our school very suddenly, for example, and other quite challenging circumstances in my career, that the role of collective leadership is vital. It's imperative, it's important, it's absolutely significant for us as human beings, as educators. Those sweets in those staff pigeonholes was collective leadership. We're all in this together, this challenging inspection regime. And taking ourselves a step out of our schools and the day-to-day operational stuff that we all have to do, what is the purpose? What do we understand the purpose to be of education? And how we can unpack education in its sense of things, educare, the Latin, Greek, to learn, to lead. What is it about education and what can our contribution be, and what values are we associating with education, in some ways as a discipline? And I think that debate about what is the purpose of education has been lost in the discourse of managerialism and leadership in schools across the world. And I'd love our university and the management of the institute, the Manchester Institute of Education, where I'm based. We don't do enough of sitting around and talking about the purpose of education. And I think that is something I'd love to kind of get involved with and invite some key thinkers to really think about the purpose of education, because it's changing and shifting. And we've got the AI issue coming in, the uncertainties of that and all other things that we know about the micropolitics of the world and so on. Thank you. Next slide, please. So where should we look for this inspiration? Now, let me tell you a little bit of a story, if you may indulge me for a few minutes. I had a great pleasure and privilege of visiting Dubai for the first time a couple of years ago, and I had one afternoon off. And I thought to myself, I could stay in the hotel and do some work, but I really wanted to perhaps understand and feel, maybe experience Dubai in some way. No, I didn't go shopping to all the malls. That's not my thing. I wanted to see some form of culture, of old Dubai. So I took myself off through the souks and so on and found myself in the Museum of the Poet, Al Khaili. And this is his home. You may have visited it. It's in Deira in Dubai. And I found this a really important experience for me. It gave me some insights to life, in 19th century, 20th century Dubai. But I really felt it was a quiet space. Museums often are, right? And this wonderful sense of endeavour, poetic endeavour with Alo Khaili, who was originally from Saudi Arabia but settled in Dubai. Can we just have the next slide, please? And I forgive my poor pronunciation, but I found this poem on a wall in that museum and I took a photograph of it and I'm sharing it with you because I think this is about hope and this is about light. So there's this angst in this slight few lines from his poem, and this sense of regret, this sense of concern in terms of weeping. But the phrase that stood out for me and I thought was helpful for us to think about in this particular presentation, it's my longing for those who hold true to their vows. And that is what I think we need to hold true to our vows or values. And I felt this was a really helpful inspiration to give us strength about holding fast to that which is good. And often that is the best way forward. And all things are happening around us. We need to hold fast, hold true to our values and vows. And I think this sums up for me what we may start to think about as leaders in turbulent times. Of course, going into a museum is a private endeavour. And I spoke to one of the curators in the museum. We had a long conversation about the poet, and I learned more about it and about him, and so on and so forth. But those private spaces give us private thinking. But of course, we need to, as public people in the public sphere, we have to live these values, and sometimes we have to live them without with recognizing that these can be criticized and problematized, but holding true is something that we perhaps must think about in terms of providing hope and light. Next slide, please. So an example I want to share with you is a person that I have a huge amount, I don't know her, but certainly what I've read and studied and thought about and listened to her is Jacinta Ardern. You may have heard of her. She was the 40th Prime Minister of New Zealand from 2017 to 2023. And so the question I ask with using this photograph of this particular individual is, what is the place of education, leadership, values today? Let's go back to that question. When all around us are such fabrications of so-called values that are problematic, and these values manifested, excuse me, in authoritative power. We see that being played out very much in the political sphere in the USA at the moment, as you may be aware. And we see those authoritarian power activities, leadership practices, with little accountability. And we see sometimes resistance may be seen to be futile. Now, for Jacinta Ardern, she led the country through two or major domestic and global crises. Most notably, you may recall, in 2019, in Christchurch, a big city, a relatively small city actually in New Zealand, where people were killed outside and inside a mosque. She does not follow the Islamic faith, but as a leader, she was there. She was present, and her compassionate response after rapid was absolutely imperative, important, justified, and deeply appreciated by those who are grieving. That's the role of leadership in times of crisis. Not only was she physically present, sharing and understanding to a certain degree these dear people's grief, she produced very quickly rapid reform politically to banish all assault weapons, which earned global praise. Doing the right thing at the right time, despite heavily criticism from her opposition colleagues in government. She also managed COVID-19 exceptionally well, apparently, and reduced many incidences of people contracting COVID by just locking down the country. Now, that became very unpopular, and she was heavily criticised for that. And she's now not an MP. She now lives in Australia, but that's for another day to talk about her. But where I think there is hope, where I think in turbulent times there's a hopefulness for teachers and school leaders, is where we look and find values or value system that does not react when provoked, that we articulate it clearly, that we embody it by notions of compassion, putting the sweets in the pigeonholes, by being with these people who are grieving after the terrible mosque tragedy shooting. But of course, our own personal values of humility and the sense of the common, understanding others within our spheres, understanding the lives and experiences to a certain degree of our students and our care and our teachers, that is when we can support and be at our very best as leaders and support children in our education systems. We also argue that leadership privileges advocacy. And, we wouldn't probably argue against a people-based leadership rooted in what Jacinta Ardern would call empathy. And she talked about leadership empathy, understanding others. She got really heavily criticised as a woman politician when she was pregnant. She was 37 when she became prime minister, became pregnant, hid her pregnancy for many months because she didn't want very much male-dominated politicians in her world to undermine her power and her influence. And she challenged notions of leadership, which were the normative notions of leadership that we should question. We've always done it like this. That sort of leadership practice, epitomised by many people in your fields probably as well, not just Jacinta Ardern and others, is not uncritical. Grace is not a position of weakness. Optimism is not weak. It is formed by citizenry. It's about that collective leadership. It's representative government in terms of our staff rooms and our work and our government and our governance. Now, we know these structures can be fragile and they can be interrogated by inspection regimes. And we know and understand, and I certainly understand to a certain degree, that at this point in time in our own contexts, we are facing incredibly challenging times, turbulent times that unsettle us, that ask questions of our very sense of existence. Let's use AI for example. But all of us located in education, I think, must embody values despite what appearances tell us. So let's hold true to our values and vows, and then we certainly can make a difference in a world that is turbulent and at this stage quite problematic. Thank you. There's a few references, but I'm sure, and a little YouTube video if you want to watch that, if you can access it YouTube. Listen to her talking about her work and what she does. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions. That was about an hour, I think. And please email me if you would like any information or want to ask questions or anything else you might want to know about.
All right. That was an incredible topic, Dr. V. Thank you very much for that. We really appreciate it. I was listening from the very start. Actually, in fact, I have the first question to ask you coming from my end. So I just
Sure.
want to ask you this before I went to, I'll go to Pia for the other questions that
Sure.
our guests would like to ask you. When you look, Dr. B, at the challenges facing education today, from AI and digital transformation to shifting learner expectations, what do you believe is the single greatest test of leadership in this moment?
How long have you got? That's a good question.
A few minutes left, Doctor, unfortunately.
I think we have to understand there is joy. We have to look for joy and hope. And you know who are the most joyous and hopeful people in our spheres are the kids.
Mm-hmm. True.
So we mustn't suppress those spontaneous elements in the right moment, of course. That's really important. For leaders, we must recognize that and put the sweets in the, whatever, in the pigeonholes. But also, as leaders, we recognize the value of our students and what they're saying and their experiences, the empathy that Jacinta Ardern talks about. We must not be fearful or intimidated by AI. We must question it, we must critique it, and we must trouble it. Because if we don't, then we're going to get a bit of trouble down the line. And there's lots of issues around AI, which I won't talk about now, but I'm very happy to, have a conversation later, another webinar perhaps. So I
Mhm.
think we mustn't be intimidated by what we would see as authoritarian or oppressive regimes, in terms of AI, I mean. I don't mean political regimes necessarily. And we must call out, we must question the photographs we're seeing, unpack them, interpret them, and then talk about them to our colleagues and our friends and our professional colleagues and even our kids. I mean, I showed that photograph and to my nephew who's 17. He's doing political history at A level at the moment, and we had a really good debate about it. So yeah, it's important that we are not hijacked all the time,
Mhm.
by performativity and inspection. But I do appreciate that's a big deal in all of our
It does.
lives,
It
in
does.
all of our lives. I
I
hope that
mean,
answers the
maybe
question.
maybe we can talk AI next time on your next
Yeah, maybe
session.
we can. Maybe
Why
we can.
not? Dr. B, I just want to add, I know I'm going to go to Pia, but there's a question here from Moazem. What do you think about case studies for trouble creating and slow learner students?
Case studies to help slow learner students. Is that right? Is that
Yeah. What do you think about case studies for trouble creating and slow learner students? Something like that.
I think pedagogy, a particular approach you take in
Okay.
your teaching, right, needs to be suitably differentiated, is the word we used to use. I think it's changed now to meet the needs of all learners, irrespective of where they're starting from and where they may indeed finish from. And that might be in a lesson, it might be over
Mm-hmm.
a series of lessons, it may be over their entire education career. And so, innovative approaches to meeting the needs of individuals, and this is where AI can be brilliantly good, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
to support, through materials and creative processes. One example is, of course, case study. One particular pedagogical approach we use, and this is for big people, professional people, we teach on for our master's program in the education leadership and practice, is we do a lot of real world scenarios. I know the MBA do as well. We spend an afternoon thinking about how we would design a school based around sustainability goals, United Nations. So sustainability goals. So real world practical elements, applications are really powerful for learners, whether they're 5 or 15 or even, 50. So I think, being aware and understanding particular needs, we can't be everything to everybody all of the time. Right, there is a resource issue, but we can use tools and support and thinking about ensuring that as far as possible we can meet the needs of all learners, irrespective of where their starting positions are. And that would be a good example, of course, be a case study, but there are many other pedagogical approaches that I think
Perfect.
you could
Thank you,
share.
Dr. B.
My pleasure.
Pia, there's a question in the chat box. If you can
Yes.
go ahead,
Beautiful
please.
session, by the way, Dr. B.
Oh, my pleasure.
We have a question here from Jose Meldin. If a leadership values are political and contested,
Yeah.
as Gunter argues, how can educational leaders make decisions that are both ethical and fair without imposing their own values on others?
Where is Professor Gunter when you need her most to answer that? Okay, great question, by the way. Thank you for these. They're so thoughtful and
Beautiful.
challenging, and this is what this is about, isn't it? We must challenge our thinking. Now, yes, I do. I sit on Gunter's side, by the way, so I'll say that. Um, Inevitably, leadership, whatever it is, let's look at that photograph again of Trump and Zelensky. Of course, it's political. Was it staged? Who brought those chairs together? Who put them so close together? Did they themselves come together and move together, knowing that there was about 1,000 cameras on them? I don't know. So, of course, leadership in its sense and its presentation is political. And the question is, how on earth, because it's political in the sense of being in the public domain, is what I see political as. I'm an Arendtian scholar, and I use Hannah Arendt in terms of her notions of politics. But in the political realm, the public realm, how can we hold true, is what you're asking me, to our own values? Well, we have to, because every one of us in the world, every individual human being has a sense of self. maybe a very distorted sense of self, but hopefully most of us have a sense of self, a sense of self-value. Sometimes that's obscured by things and challenges, but a self-value, a sense of value is really important. And inevitably, when we're in the public space, which is a school, and schools are political spaces as well, of course, we have to, our inherent individual values start to inform, possibly complement the values that are being imposed on us from our brands and our franchisees and so on and so forth. And that is where the consensus needs to operate. That is where people who are owners of schools or proprietors or international groups need to trust me. And that's difficult. That's a conversation that can be difficult sometimes to do what I'm doing for the students in my school. I know I have to market my school. I have to do this for my university course, by the way. I'm involved with marketing, I'm in presentations and so on and so forth, but I'm also teaching. And so where do the values, the external values meet the internal values, my own personal values, my own moral compass? And generally speaking, most leaders and teachers in schools, because it's an altruistic endeavor most of the time, holistic endeavor, that the values that people hold usually are, pretty important, and not extreme. And if they're extreme, often they don't teach. So I think it's important having that internal dialogue with yourself, and as far as possible, being able to help support the articulation of values that may be a blend of those coming from wherever else, but hold true to our own. How do we treat people? That's not imposed from afar. How do we engage with the really difficult student? And the teacher's really tired of this kid kicking off a bit in the classroom, and it's been pushed up the ladder, and I was a deputy head in charge of behaviour in my school. We had some challenging. How do I deal with that student? How do I understand why the student is behaving the way they're being? What is my value system? What do I value most of all? Well, in one sense, I value that student taking responsibility for the actions that that student presented to a teacher and apologising first and foremost. There may be a punishment, of course, and that's right and proper. There's always a consequence to these behaviours and choices. So that's important. We hold, this is this wonderful poet, hold fast to the values that we inherently hold in ourselves. They may be pushed, and change a bit, but we articulate them. And then people say to you, "Oh, you really believe in me. You believe in me as a pupil, miss. Sir, doctor. I thank you so much for having faith in me." And they're the things you want to hear, because they're the things that that your values are being embodied by yourself, how you walk, how you speak, what you say, what you don't say, how you respond in a crisis as a leader. You know, um, the sweets and the pigeonholes again. How do we respond? That was a little mini crisis for some of our colleagues, right? So that's all part of the tension between the value system and the politics of values. I hope that's answered the question. It's a long
All
answer.
right. Thank you for that, Dr. B. P, I think Moazam rose his hand. We can allow him to speak if
Oh,
he would
please
like
do.
to ask. Moazam, please, the floor is open for you. You have any
Thank
question
you.
for Dr.
Thank
B?
you. Thank you very much.
Most welcome.
So my question is that what is the effect of AI on the cognitive power of the students? Because AI is definitely disturbing or just disturbing the cognitive and understanding power. They are just believing on AI and just answering the question using the AI, but their cognition is lacking. They are not developing their cognition. That is my question.
Good question. I think let's make it about values. What are what are our as leaders, teachers, educators, our understanding of AI? Okay, well, let's just look at the word artificial first. Let's just put that out there. I'm a critical scholar, so I will trouble phrasing and terms. So, do students recognize that this intelligence, and it's not sentient, so it's not really intelligent, it's a database, a huge, massive, scraping, often Western cultural, so there's all that going on. And the cognitive ability is lazy students think and they do it at the university as well, by the way. Lazy students, in other words, lazy, that's pretty harsh, but people who want shortcuts and present their work that has been generated from AI tools to as their own. That's the problem we're having. Students presenting work that they are presenting as their own. That's unethical and it's plagiarism. So that's formal stuff, because the reason why they do that is A, because they've left their essays too late and they're trying to rush it. B, they're a bit lazy and they just want a quick solution and it's not very effective. Or C, they don't fully understand the power and the shortcomings and the artificial nature of AI. So what I would say is we have to teach our students to be discerning. We have to value wisdom. We have to teach our students that if they spend hour after hour on their mobile phones 10 years ago, in bed and in the night and when they're supposed to be asleep, then that will have an impact on their sleep and their well-being and so on and so forth. And we're seeing that now. Countries around the world are banning social media and screen time. It's the same for AI. If we see it as a dialogic tool, as I do, and that's what the research is coming out of our university at the moment, that we use it as a sparring partner, and it takes skill, it takes Socratic questioning to continually, iteratively ask AI to reframe and respond and produce different responses to the problem you're presenting it. And when you start to do that and use it as a dialogical partner, then you start to get a much more critical response to your original thought. And that's what we're going to teach students. Dialogical debate using Socratic questioning will certainly help students recognize the limitations, the vacuous nature, the authoritarianism, and the ownership of knowledge. Who is creating this knowledge? Who owns the knowledge? Einstein said in the late 1940s, if knowledge is owned by an elite, then humanity is going to face serious problems. And we're at that point now. AI is asking us existential questions. And what we have to do, governments will react very slowly because they do generally, big governments. But we have to, as educators, start to take the initiative ourselves, start to educate our students to be discerning. What's right, what's wrong, what's artificial, and then act upon that discernment, act upon that wisdom. So critically engage with AI, being cynical about it, because we get it all the time here. It's all in the news. AI. And who's promoting the brand of AI? It's the people like the AI. It's ChatGPT. It's Microsoft. It's Claude. It's DeepSeek. It's all of them. This is the answer to all our questions. It will save jobs. It will give us this, that, and the other. But no,
Gemini
they're
also.
they're selling. They're selling something. They're commodifying it, and we'll have to pay for it eventually because it's a commodification. It's a product. It's all free at the moment. We buy into it. We love it. We use it. Oh my goodness, it's transformed my life. Well, no. And then suddenly it be commodified and we'll become a consumer and we'll have to kind of consume it. So you can see where I'm coming from, Azam. But yes, we have to teach students how to use any tool, whether it's a pencil, whether it's a whiteboard, whether it's a mobile phone or a scientific calculator, or these huge instruments called artificial intelligence. And if we don't do that, we'll be in trouble, as will the students.
Thank you, Dr. B.
There you go.
Thank you,
Okay.
You can
Moazam,
see
for
where
your
I am
question.
at. You can
Thank
see where I
you.
am at with AI.
Exactly, exactly.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Moazam, for
Thank
participating.
you.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank
Pia,
you.
question please. Time constraint. We can only have a couple of questions. Pia,
Sure.
go ahead,
Okay.
please.
Yes, we have actually a couple, but since we are under time pressure, we'll have to ask one last one.
Okay.
It's from Zuhaib. What can be the impact if the teacher feels disengaged in a school?
Well, the impact of a disengaged teacher is the same as an impact of a disengaged student. They check out, and then for lots of reasons, their motivation's problematic, or they've had a difficult time, or personal things impact our work, don't they? And our ability to have impact as educators when things are happening in our own private lives, and that's also problematic. The impact of a teacher who has, lost their mojo, their motivation, is key, and we have to sensitively and appropriately, and this is again about values, the word compassion. We have to understand and take time out why this individual is perhaps not as impactful. Word I don't use easily, impact, hard to measure, apart from with data. And understand, why that teacher might be demotivated, might want to check out, whatever it is. Now, there's times in my life where I've had to engage with a person over a period of time, whereby the performance the teaching, the quality of the teaching rather than the impact, the quality of teaching was diminishing, and therefore there came a point where we had to say, let's start again. You may need to teach elsewhere. And that's extreme. But engaging with these people, our value system is that we value our students, we must value our teachers. We recognize there are things in lives that may get in the way professionally, and we need to understand that. Might not always be the leader, it may be someone else involved with, teacher pastoral care. But we have to have a culture of care for everybody as leaders, and that includes teachers as well, doesn't it? And so those conversations are important with the teacher to find out and understand what's going on, and obviously then there are things that you can do, performance management processes and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Dr. B. It's an absolute all those questions, by the way, to all our guests. Before we wrap up, Doctor, just a little announcement here. We do have our open hour for our master's program. Whoever from you wants to know more about the University of Manchester program, such as the Masters in Education, Leadership, and Practice, please come and see us. Happening every Friday at 7 p.m. And it's going to happening this week again. Please scan the QR code if you want to join and register yourself, and we'll be more than happy to talk more on your educational journey. Also, apart from this masterclass, this successful masterclass we did with Dr. B, if you want to learn more about the upcoming events, especially the one happening this coming June 8th, which is the Global Executive MBA program for all across centers will be there. All the directors will be a part of it. It's going to be a massive and incredible event. Please join us in the webinar, scan that QR code. And if you want to learn more for the University of Manchester team, you want to know more about your journey, how to begin your journey, how we can help you possibly in the future, please scan the QR code. It will be on June 9th at 7 p.m. as well. And of course, we always do this every year. It's going to be Meet the Founding Director and CEO, of course, Randa Besiso will be highlighting on June 16 if you would like to ask her any questions under the sun about your journey for your education. She'll be more than happy to answer for you.
Joe, can I just interrupt? And if you do meet Randa, do ask her about her leadership, because she's incredibly powerful, wonderful, inspirational female leader of her field. And just research it, she's fantastic. But talk to her about her leadership, because she's fantastic. There you go.
Thank you, Dr. B. Those are kind words, Doctor. Thank you. And of course, follow us on socials for more of these. If you haven't found out us from different platform, you can always find us out in our social from Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and of course, if you could review us in Google to improve more of what we do here. And of course, thank you, Dr. B, for sharing such insightful perspectives and practical wisdom with us today. Your reflections on heading through uncertainty have reminded us that effective leadership is not defined by calm conditions, but by how we respond when circumstances are at their most challenging. And to everyone who joined us, thank you for your engagement, thoughtful questions, and commitment to shaping the future of education.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. B. And today's discussion has highlighted a powerful reality. While the educational landscape continues to evolve, great leadership remains a constant force for progress, resilience, and positive change. So we hope you leave this session not only with new ideas, but with renewed confidence to lead with purpose, inspire others, and make a meaningful impact within your institutions and communities. At the University of Manchester, Dubai, we are proud to support professionals and leaders through world-class education, global connections, and a lifelong learning community that spans across industries and continents. My name is Pia Silvan. Have a great day ahead.
Dr. B, we will see you soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much again. And as we conclude, let us remember that leadership is not measured by the absence of challenges, but by the courage to navigate them. The ideas shared today remind us that uncertainty can be the catalyst for innovation, growth, and meaningful change when approached with purpose and vision. Together, through learning, collaboration, and shared experiences, we can continue to shape a brighter future for education with stronger ideas, stronger impact, stronger future, stronger together. Thank you once again for spending your time with us this afternoon. We wish you a continued success on your leadership journey, and we look forward to welcoming you to the future events and programs at the University of Manchester, Dubai. On behalf of our founding director, Randa Besizo, and the incredible University of Manchester, Dubai team, Hussam is with us today, Pia, and again, thank you once again, Dr. B,
Okay.
and everyone who made all this possible. My name is Josen Ranyola. Thank you all for joining us today. Please keep safe and remember to always to be that change. Until then, masalama everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. B.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.